want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am your host, as always, Rick Wilson. I am joined today by David Brown. David and I are going to take a trip way back in political history in America. You're probably thinking to yourself, something that happened 170 years ago can't possibly be relevant to the moment we're in right now. But I'm going to tell you, David is the author of a fantastic new book called A Hell of a Storm: The Battle for Kansas, the End of Compromise, and the Coming of the Civil War. Folks, I know your history lessons were probably pretty far back in your dim and distant past, but there was a moment in this country where the beginnings of the Civil War came into sight. Something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. It broke what was then the Whig Party, which became the Republican Party. It was a moment where what looked like a long history of political stability in the country was coming to a painful end. David has chronicled this moment, and I want to talk to him today about that moment in history, why that inflection point led to the Civil War, and what it means for today. So, David, welcome to the Enemies List podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today. Tell us about, and I know folks are thinking, oh my God, a history lesson from these guys, but this is a history lesson I think we really need to pay attention to. Talk to us about the moment that you chronicle in Hell of a Storm.
Sure. So I look at 1854. This was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in a nutshell, you had all these Western territories, and they had been, most of them, formerly closed to slavery. And in 1854, Congress passed through an act which most Americans didn't want, known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed slaves to enter these territories. And it was, I think, the critical act on the way to civil war. There was a long road, it was a rocky road, but I think after 1854, there was really nothing that was going to impede the momentum that led to the Civil War.
Right. And tell people what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did and how it broke the Whig Party.
Sure. So, back in time, there was the Louisiana Purchase. This was in 1803, and there was this question, what should happen with this territory? Free or slave? In 1820, there was the Missouri Compromise, and the vast majority of that territory was preserved for free labor. Slavery couldn't come in. Mm-hmm. And then things happen. The country continues to expand. There's a lot of pressure to open up these territories. And in 1854, Congress allows for slavery to enter these territories. The Whig Party was really America's second party. The Democratic Party had been formed in the 1790s, a coalition really begun by Madison and Jefferson. Mm-hmm. But it was a national coalition, and it was the nation's most effective political party. Jefferson democracy, Jackson democracy, and it won most of the presidential elections. It had most of the congressional majorities. But Whiggery was the number two party. The Whigs had won a couple of presidential elections, sure, had some congressional majorities, and it was seen as maybe more of the compromise party. And so its implosion in 1854 is an indication that we're really moving from a period in which compromises, whether it was to compromise to draft a constitution or to bring Missouri into the Union or to have this compromise of 1850 to deal with lands taken from Mexico with the Mexican-American War. That was part of the DNA of the country, which was, we compromised on these issues. But slavery had come to a point. I think there were enough people in the country who were not abolitionists, but they were opposed to the idea of the expansion of slavery to put a stop to that. Whiggery was behind the curve. Whiggery was reflecting back on this older compromise culture, and it did not survive the conflict, the brouhaha that comes out of this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And as you noted earlier, the demise of the Whig Party is going to then lead to the rise of the Republican Party.
Were the folks in the Whig Party who made this compromise, who ended up with making this compromise in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, do you think they realized that this was like a suicide pact? Do you think they realized this was going to end the movement that they had represented?
No, I don't think that they did. I think that they presumed, because this was always in the DNA, this was in the history lessons, that Americans compromise over these issues.
Mm-hmm.
No sense, and as you know, history can move pretty quickly.
Sure.
No sense of how far the country had really moved in a short period of time. In the early republic, our statecraft was very much Atlantic facing towards Europe. We'd had a couple of wars with the British, for example. We had to contend, even in American politics, with the French Revolution. But then our foreign policy turns more inward towards our frontier. There is a war of choice against the Republic of Mexico, which brought in a tremendous amount of territory.
Right.
And there was questions, what do you do with that territory? There were attempts to purchase Cuba and bring it to the Union. And for some Southerners, and this would also include Southern Whigs, this would be an effort perhaps to offset the inclusion of free labor California into the Republic, which had just been brought into the Union after the war with Mexico. And so it's this reflection upon, older times and older statecraft, but really, just over the last 6 or 7 years, since the late 1840s, the situation had changed dramatically. And I don't think that some of these Whig politicians or some of these Democratic politicians really understood that the people, particularly people in the North, were changing their views about how they looked upon the future of the federal territories.
Right. And so as the Whigs collapse, you see the Northern Whigs sort of drift into the new Republican Party, and the Southern Whigs sort of, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, this is sort of always my read, they migrated to the sort of the know-nothing approach and eventually into, the politics of the Deep South at the time, the Democratic Party as it was then constituted. So that split, and the tension inside the Whig Party about both slavery and about expansion, left it at a dead end. But that dead end also ended up, I think, sending the South a very, clear signal that they didn't have a unified opposition at first. They weren't going to face a singular force that eventually emerged in the North. What is it that we can take out of that lesson from today about how when a party is collapsing into something that that we don't recognize anymore, what are the signals that we should be paying attention to now that come out of these lessons of history?
Well, we should not, and this is ironic because obviously I'm an historian,
Sure.
but I would say that the lessons of history can only tell us so much.
Mm-hmm.
To reflect upon what we were saying earlier, in a sense, the Whig Party, it was doomed not because it forgot history, but because it didn't forget history. In other words, it didn't understand how quickly things were changing, and it got caught up in that smash up of the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Right.
So there are lots of efforts, particularly written around election periods to try to kind of predict the future. Most of these books kind of just disappear and die quietly because it's very, very difficult to predict the future, obviously, for anybody, let alone a historian whose head is in the past. What we can take away from this today, I think, is that we have to understand that times, they do move quickly, that when we think about the kinds of questions that pollsters ask, are these really current questions, or do they reflect things that really are from 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago? There's a kind of greatest hits. There's a beat, and oftentimes we fall into the groove of this. For example, so when I think of the Republican Party today, I as an historian, I'm sort of interested. I think in what you might be suggesting, that is there some type of paradigm shift in the future that's going to happen here, and it looks like there's at least a couple of major components. There's a MAGA component, and then there's a more traditional, I'm not sure what you want to call that, maybe a Reaganite component as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to that? Is there a continuance of Trumpism, or depending upon how elections go in the future, if there's not success there, electoral success, do they move on? If they move on, it's no guarantee that it's going to look like a sort of quasi 1980s or 90s Reaganism, but it might evolve into something else, depending upon things that have happened, but things that have not happened that probably will be happening over the next 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years.
So, when you wrote this book, you decided, I think, from my reading, it was not just going to be a straight political history. You weave into a lot of the cultural moments, the writers, the thinkers of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of political history ends up ignoring or not properly addressing those aspects of it. Talk to us a little bit about how the culture was changing as the Civil War approached in the country, as well as the politics.
Sure. There was, through much of the North, even though it was a Democratic majority, we might say that it was consistently Whiggish, from the perspective that most people view themselves as being pretty moderate, and there is this jarring sensation that comes out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Amos Lawrence, who was a very wealthy man in Massachusetts, people in Kansas might know him because of Lawrence, Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the individuals who endowed the University of Kansas, and he was in support of sending free laborers out to Kansas.
Right.
And he made a comment about this time about how we went to bed, in Greater Boston, just staunch moderate Whigs, and we woke up.
Radical Republicans.
Radical Republicans, exactly. And how and when did this happen? I think I also mentioned in the book that Abraham Lincoln is died in the Whig wool, died in the wool Whig, and Henry Clay, who was the great Whig figure, was his
the last great Whig. Yeah,
the last great Whig. Yeah, and Lincoln is writing, in late 1854, when the election cycle has demonstrated that Whiggery that has no future, and Lincoln's saying, I'm not really sure what's going on here. I still think of myself as a Whig, but people are telling me that there is no Whig Party. And so he's looking for a place to land. He knows at this point it's probably going to be the Republican Party, but he doesn't really want to commit himself to this because the Republican Party is about 5 minutes old.
right.
And so that this speaks really to the uncertainty of the moment and to how the earth was shifting very quickly. In 2024, we have seen just in the last 2 or 3 months a number of things that have happened that have had an impact on the November election. And it wasn't just like that in 1854, but I think with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it set things in motion that really dominated the electoral cycle in ways that people at the beginning of the year could not have imagined.
I had an opportunity a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, to speak at Cooper Union, and I stood at the podium that Lincoln had stood at when he gave the Right Makes Might speech, and I had gone back and reread it a couple of times, and the way he spoke about the emergent Republican Party, it didn't feel like it was a new party by that point. It was such a short period of time, but when he was talking in the section where he talks about, where he addresses the emergent Republican Party, about the duty to oppose slavery and the duty to not have the states, no longer allow the states to have people in chattel slavery. It struck me that you're right. I think that's what you're saying about how quickly the parties, how quickly the things moved. That felt like a speech of something that had been a much longer antecedent to it. There'd been a much longer idea underneath it. That opposition to slavery, the terrible compromise in the beginning of our country. It took that 70-year period for it to as they say, sugar out down south, to become this conflict, to become this moment where the Civil War was inevitable. As you're writing about this, as you're looking at this, do you think there was ever a way that we could have addressed this and solved this without a war, without a civil war that cost 600,000 lives, without breaking the country nearly permanently?
Yeah, that's the great question. Of course, it's tricky because one doesn't want to go too far down the path of historical inevitability and say that that a civil war was inevitable. If one wants to look at a real inflection point, then obviously there is the Constitutional Convention, and we know quite a bit about it because James Madison, who was really one of the primary architects of the document, he took a lot of notes, and
Right.
we have access to his notes, and he wrote to Jefferson, who was not at the convention, but sort of apprising him of what was happening there, and Madison said that he was disappointed as an advocate of the Constitution, and also as a Virginian, that the document couldn't take a firmer stand, sort of accepting slavery, but not really seeing it expand or it grow. In large part, at least the two states that he identified at that time were Georgia and South Carolina, which would have been pretty much the two deepest South states at that time.
Sure.
Both had been really devastated by the American Revolution. The British had really harmed their economies, and they were looking to build their economies up again, and to really use slaves as much as anything to do that. And so when there was a call to can we end the slave trade right now, rather than wait for a generation to do it, these two states were opposed. I think also that suggests a broader opposition, probably mostly among deep Southern states, not so much among Virginia at this time, to oppose the institution. So I think if there was a point where we might have not had to go down that path, it's really before the path was really rolled out. But if there could have been triggers put into the Constitution, so that you could not have ended the institution of slavery at that time, the states would not have allowed that. But to have perhaps firmly made it impossible for the institution to travel, to go deep into the Gulf, deep into the nation's interior, as it would, because when that begins to happen, it creates a momentum of its own, and then an expectation of its own that's going to continue. And also, just in terms of, we talked about the culture earlier. In terms of the culture, it means that whether it's schools or newspapers or churches, that the message comes from the pulpits, that this is the thing to do, that this is, as Americans, what we do. And so if it gets nipped in the bud, then perhaps there isn't a kind of a cultural apparatus that just begins to presume that slavery will expand, because it always has expanded.
Right. And even though other, like, European countries were well ahead of us on beginning abolition. I mean, we had a British abolitionist movement, and I can't remember what Cowper's piece of poetry was, but it was from the 1760s, right? He's like, slavery can't exist here if they breathe our air for 1 minute, they're free. That never quite caught with America, and the complications of the Spanish slave trade to the Caribbean, and how the Asiento allowed them to keep flooding the Caribbean, even as we were slowing down a little bit on slavery. I'm always fascinated by why it took us so long to catch up with what Europe was doing at the time, because the slave trade from Spanish feeding their empire, Spanish and Portuguese feeding their empire from Africa to Brazil and South America, even that was stressed and strained by the end, because it was so fundamentally immoral. Why did it take us as long to reach the conflict point? Was it just our expansion and the need for the pure labor drive, or what was it about us that took so damn long to fix this problem or to address it?
So slavery was a vital part of the American economy, and not just the Southern economy.
Right.
Northern insurers, law firms, people who would provide things like textiles, shoes, farm implements. In the North, that was part of the system as well.
Right.
I think in England, you had this is off the top of my head now, but something like maybe 12 or 14,000 enslaved people on the island.
Right.
About the time in the 1780s when a court decision manumitted them, said that there's
Right.
no positive law in England that accepted slavery. It still was a couple of generations after that, not until the 1830s, that the British sugar islands in the West Indies
Yes.
were emancipated. And at that time, the enslavers went along with it. I would guess in large part because it was compensated emancipation, so they got paid. In America, you see small numbers. The Quakers beginning roughly in the 1750s, but you're right. You don't really have a push until I think the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, when an increasing number of white people who would not really view themselves as being abolitionists, but
Right.
they would begin to perceive that the expansion of slavery could harm their future, because it isn't just that slavery is expansive, but free labor, capitalism is expansive too. And so, if we can look in the future, then the question is, well, what is the future of the Jeffersonian purchase? What is the future of the lands that were acquired from Mexico? Will it be for slavery, or will it be for free labor? So then I think the self-interest takes over. But before that time, slavery is such a large part of the American economy that it doesn't really move the moral needle that much.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that idea that a boundless or a seemingly boundless nation was caught in that system is one we haven't really. I don't know that we've reckoned with that. Even after the Civil War, I don't know we've fully reckoned with that, the moral question of that time. So, talk to us about what were the crisis points in this period, from the Missouri Compromise until the Civil War. What were the areas that you found the most interesting when you were writing this history?
There's just so much that happens. You've got a state, South Carolina, which looks to nullify a federal law, which is nominally about tariff, but I think really it's about the institution of slavery, and that's really the high watermark of states' rights before the Civil War. But that's a generation before, in the 1830s, and you could see where things are moving. That path is being shown to us. The war with Mexico, it really quickens, if I could put it this way, it quickens history. It puts us on the path where Whiggery begins to fall behind the curve. It leads us to the question of what do we do with slavery in all the territories that we have. We see individuals, and I write about Henry David Thoreau in this book, and people like George Fitzhugh, who a lot of people haven't heard of.
No.
He's a Southerner, he's a Virginian, and he's very critical, like Thoreau, of the American capitalist system. And they write two books, and both these books come out the year of the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Sure.
And Thoreau's is Walden, which obviously many of us are familiar with. Fitzhugh, his book is on what he calls a sociology for the South, and he stands by the institution of slavery. So culturally, literary, intellectually, we see kind of two interesting focal points where two writers can agree that they're not really happy with the decline of agrarianism, some forms of traditionalism. They're unsure about the rise of industry, but they approach these things in diametrically different ways. Henry David Thoreau is an opponent. He's an abolitionist.
Absolutely.
And Fitzhugh, of course, stands by the South. And so whether we're looking at congressional acts, whether we're looking at a state which seeks to nullify federal law, or individuals like Fitzhugh and Thoreau, who to use present-day language, particularly with somebody like Fitzhugh, who was popular in the South, he would be considered, I suppose, a thought leader, someone who would guide opinion. All these things begin to come together, I think, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in a way that they hadn't come together before. And by this time, the mid-1850s, it takes on more meaning. Things that happened in the past, you begin to read a little bit differently because you begin to frame it within, again, a path or a network, all moving towards a certain way, a certain direction. And for some people, that direction was ultimately the Union cannot stand. There must be two republics in North America.
But I mean, I remember I read Fitzhugh, and it was 40 years ago, so it's very hazy to me. I have not reviewed it, or when you mentioned it, I was like, I read this guy many, many, many decades ago, and he was, I don't know if he was the absolute origin story, but he was one of the promulgators of that. Oh, the Negroes of the South are happy and they're joyous and they sing in the fields and all that shit. I'm like, and that was my memory of how it read to me at the time, more like what became the core of that sort of lost cause myth. Oh, it wasn't as bad as you thought. It had some flaws, but it certainly wasn't hell on earth. Well, we know that it was hell on earth. It's interesting to me that your point is about how the culture intersects here. Thoreau is remembered and beloved, and Fitzhugh is forgotten. And I think, except in sort of a niche way, because that argument that the slaves in the South were happy, slave and happy do not seem to me to be coincidental terms, that you can put together here. So, well, I want to thank you so much, David Brown, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. It was an interesting and I think deep conversation about a book, folks, you should read. A Hell of a Storm: The Battle for Kansas, The End of Compromise, and the Coming of the Civil War. As in many things, he catches just how fast American politics changes, just how deeply our culture still is impinged upon by the origins and the consequences of slavery and the Civil War. It is a great book. I recommend it, and I hope you guys will go out and give it a read. Thanks so much for coming on the Enemies List today, David, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Rick. I enjoyed the talk.